Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Welcome to tonight's talk at the Oriental Ceramics Society of Hong Kong. And tonight we have a wonderful opportunity to speak with Dr. Frank Feltens. Dr. Frank Feltens is the Japan Foundation Associate Curator of Japanese Art at the Freer Gallery of Art and the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery, Smithsonian Institution. He holds a PhD in Japanese art history from Columbia University. Dr. Feltens is a specialist in Japanese art with a focus on late medieval and early modern periods. He has published and lectured on a range of topics related to Japanese art. Recent articles examine the painters Ogata Kōrin and Sakai Hoitsu, and the photographer Doman Ken. Prior to coming to the Freer and Sackler, he held research positions at the Museum of Modern Art, New York, and the Neizu Museum of Tokyo. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Feltens. Okay, please take it away.
Thank you so much for this very kind introduction, and good morning, good evening, everybody from wherever you are tuning in. I'm very pleased to be invited today, and I want to thank the Oriental Ceramics Society for giving me this wonderful opportunity to think about Ogata Kōrin together with you. And so the occasion of this talk, and I'm even more pleased to be introducing my new book on Ogata Kōrin, Art in Early Modern Japan. And so when thinking and talking about Kōrin, I always like to start with Kōrin's impact in the contemporary world, especially in Japan, because he is such an important cultural figure in the national consciousness and the modern identity of Japan. And to me, always, and living in Washington, you know, political things are always very important for our lives and also for our work at the museum here at the Smithsonian. And so I'm always struck when going to Japan and I see Kōrin everywhere. And one of the most recognizable ways in which he is really appropriated by contemporary Japan is through the country's currency, so the 5,000 yen bill. And I'm sure all of you have been to Japan at one point or another. And you know, Japan is a very paper-based economy still, so you do use paper money more than credit cards nowadays still. And so you will notice on the back of the 5,000 yen bill, you see a detail of Kōrin's famous iris screens, which is, you know, one of his most famous, if not the most famous work by him at the Neizu Museum in Tokyo. And it's where I had the great fortune of working for a period of time. And I just want to say, I will talk a bit about these works a bit later and about my own experience working with them at the Neizu in a moment. But just for you to, just to set the stage for us, another image of another iconic iris painting by Kōrin that is at the Metropolitan Museum, where Kōrin inserted this beautiful and very strikingly painted diagonal geometric bridge into the iris work. And the reproduction of that iconic painting that is kept in New York formed the backdrop of the G7 summit at Iseshima in Japan in 2016 for meetings of world leaders. So it framed sort of this the self-representation of Japan on the world stage, on the political world stage. And I think that is really in the same way as the country's currency, an indicator of how Japan, how Kōrin is still cherished in Japan, but also how he is appropriated and brought into the contemporary world. And there are so many other examples, and in the book I talk about it. First thing, just to set the stage, at the carpet in the Prime Minister's office in Tokyo has the irises as its motif. There's countless other instances also at the Tokyo Olympics that just concluded where this iconic flower that Kōrin really put onto the world stage is being used. So today I also, together with you, want to think about Kōrin through the lens of the irises, because it's such a mesmerizing flower and mesmerizing way of depicting this very simple but striking subject. So, of course, Kōrin is not all about irises. There is so much more to his oeuvre than this, but this really this historic, poetic, seasonal, cultural flower really forms a perfect window onto Kōrin's artistry, not just in painting, but in all kinds of other media, which I think might be interesting to you as a ceramic society as well, thinking about all the ways in which Kōrin translated his experiences in painting into various different media, starting with lacquer and ceramics as well. Yes, why is this painting so important? It is important for so many different reasons. One of them being it's one of his first major commissions, and you can, if you look at it, you see already that Kōrin was started out as an incredibly skilled and versatile artist almost from the very beginning of his career. Just to show you a little bit of a close-up of the work, how these mineral pigments, all of these are mineral-based pigments that come as a powder and need to be bound with animal glue in order to be adhesive and in order to be applied onto the surface of this folding screen, which is one of the traditional formats in Japanese painting. But Kōrin added layer upon layer of these very expensive, rare pigments, especially the blue azurite is a very rare pigment it's a very expensive pigment in Japan at the time, to create these lush surfaces that, although they on the screen it's impossible to convey, but in real life, really, this lush glistening surface, the slight sheen and glistening of the mineral pigment really in so many ways replicates the velvety surface of real irises. And at the Neze Museum, where these works are kept, the beautiful thing is every year they are brought out in May, at the same time as the irises are blooming in the garden of the museum. So it's a wonderful occasion to actually compare how Kōrin translated these flowers into a work that seems so stylized, but at the same time is also incredibly naturalistic. And I think that is one of Kōrin's great achievements in Japanese art, that he is right at the sweet spot between stylization and naturalism, and really brings out the best of both of these worlds and fuses them together. And I do want to add a personal experience here, just if you would indulge me for a second, because when I was working at the Neze Museum a few years back, I had the great opportunity of climbing into the exhibition case with these screens. So I was able to see these so close, and I had to be mindful not to touch them, of course, as a matter of fact, and which was such a great privilege, because even if you look at these in storage, you will never be able to get up this close, because even the curators are very careful about this. So this was an incredible opportunity to be together with my colleagues in this screen and putting these screens up. But when I was doing that, I noticed this teeny tiny hair of Kōrin's brush that still is sticking to one of these iris leaves. You can't see it on the screen. I don't have a picture of it right now, but it kind of gave me this beautiful sort of feeling of immediacy, as if I was seeing Kōrin's hands still moving across the surface, and this teeny tiny brush hair of the brush detaching from his brush and immortalizing itself onto this painting. So this is the kind of thing that art historians obsess about, especially if you are working on a single painter like me. And so this was really a little message from the past, I almost want to say. Another way in which Kōrin was innovative, and in which he really reshuffled the forms of, or the possibilities of expression in Japanese art, is by subtly inserting into these screens and other works as well these subtle repetitions of exactly the same configurations of iris flowers in this case, But you don't notice this at first. So for example, if you looked at the screen in real life or on the screen here in front of you at home, you will not immediately notice that there is repetition going on. It's so carefully embedded. But if you look very closely, and if I tell you, you will notice that this cluster here of irises is repeated in almost exactly the same way here in the same screen. But this is done so carefully and so subtly that it is not immediately noticeable. And as a matter of fact, it has not been commented upon in writing until 1956, when a painter noticed this, a modern painter notices and wrote a small article in Japanese about it. So who knows if this escaped viewers over centuries, or if he was just the first to notice this. But the fact that this this repetition is inserted in such an unrecognizable but still sort of powerful way tells you a lot about the calculation and the careful composition that Kōrin applied to his works, not just this screen, but many others as well. So now I do want to take a step back and start where Kōrin actually decided to become a painter, because he came from a family of wealthy textile merchants in Kyoto, born and bred in the capital and steeped in its culture. And this, he was part of high society in Kyoto at the time, interacted with court nobles, with people of his own class, the upper class townsmen. But because he came from such a family of means, it seems like in the early stages he wasn't really interested in learning any profession whatsoever, because he felt he was sure to be the second son. He wasn't meant to inherit the business, but he still was able to live the carefree life of the offspring of a wealthy family. So initially Kōrin trained as a performer, more as a hobby, maybe as a profession, or a little bit of both. So he set out to be a performer in the No Theater. And this quote here is the first instance of Kōrin performing No as an 18-year-old man in front of the abbot of a Samboin, which is a sub-temple of the Daigoji monastery in Kyoto, and the abbot of this temple is always a descendant from the imperial family. So in this case, you see how the kind of environment that Kōrin navigated in from an early age, literally from his teenage years. So this is the kind of culture in which he grew up and the kind of performative background which he built for himself. And he was so good at performing that 20 years later, after decades of performing with and for aristocrats, he suddenly received his first commission for a painting in 1695. And if you think about that, Kōrin was born in 1658. This was quite late. He was almost more than 30 years old, actually, in his mid-30s. So that was a very late starting point for a painter in early modern Japan, because if you belong to any of the professional ateliers, like the Kano school, for example, you would apprentice from an early age and receive your first commissions as a teenager, for example. So why did Kōrin take up painting so late in his 30s, whereas his road and his trajectory up until then seemed to be focused so much on performance and on the theater, on the arts of the stage instead of the arts of the brush? One of those reasons is really because Kōrin didn't have a good hand with money. He was, and I love telling these stories because it's a little bit, salacious in so many ways, but Kōrin had so many different affairs with, a number of women. One of them actually ended up in a lawsuit where Kōrin accidentally fathered a son with a woman he was married to, and the family sued him. Literally, actually for child support, you would want to call it in today's terms. So Kōrin had to surrender one of his houses, money, in order to sustain, in order to, for the child to grow up with a certain security. And though this is just one instance of many in which Kōrin had to pay substantial sums for his dalliances here and there. So he squandered a lot of money. So in various different ways as well. So in short, he needed to find a way to sustain himself. He needed to find a way to get income, because the inheritance that he received from his family had literally been he had lost it through all these missteps in his life. So, and because he seemed to have had some kind of training in painting, which was completely normal and customary actually for people of his class to be trained in painting and all of the other arts, calligraphy, performance, these kinds of things. He was asked by the people he performed for to create a set of hanging scrolls with fan paintings here for the wife of one of his acquaintances, who was actually the daughter of the empress. Of the emperor and the retired emperor and empress Shinjo Saimoni. So in that sense, Kōrin's very first commission of these small fan paintings both originated from his need to fend for a living, but also from the network that he had built for himself through performance among the highest strata of imperial society, of aristocratic society in Kyoto. And this kind of connection, this dualism of needing to make a living and having these incredible connections, really formed Kōrin's early approach to aesthetics. So, and led the way to works like the iris screens. So if you think about the irises and their powerful, thick pigments, their powerful visual expressions, the very carefully calculated composition that we just thought about a few moments ago. Look at the work down below here. This rather simple work done mainly in ink, on paper, relatively inexpensive pigments. This is the commission, the first large format commission that Kōrin was asked to do in the late 1690s, shortly after he was asked to make these fans that I just showed you the quote about. And just a few years after the screen down here, he was asked to make the iris screen. So there was this incredible jump in creativity and an artistic prowess that no one who studies Kōrin is quite able to place. How did he move from a simple work like this to a gorgeous, absolutely stunning commission like the one up, like the iris screens, and just in the span of just a couple of years, 5 years at most, there must have been some kind of explosion of creativity and learning that preceded that. And one of the more compelling theories for Kōrin's artistic development in that short period of time is that suddenly he turned to the arts of another painter who was connected to Kōrin and Kōrin's family and his lineage in different ways. And that painter is called Tavarea Sotatsu, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and if not, I just want to say that Sotatsu lived in the early 17th century, so passed away about half a century before Kōrin, and really formulated this style that Kōrin would eventually adopt, these comparatively flat compositions, these stylized shapes, watery applications of pigments, but still in the use of these very thick and very overtly applied mineral pigments like azurite and malachite, those kinds of things that later on would be translated into Kōrin's own works. And if you look at this work here on the left by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the fan on the right in the Freer in our museum, you see immediately the connection between that Kōrin was definitely looking towards Sotatsu for artistic inspiration. And he did so probably exactly around the time between his very earliest screen painting, this very simple ink-based work, and irises. So this is how he learned the art of painting in a very strong and powerful way. And why did he choose Sotatsu to do this? So actually, Sotatsu is one of is really one of early modern Japan's most influential painters, although so little is known about him. But what we do know is that he worked with one of Kōrin's great-grand uncles, for example. So there was a family connection between them. And one of Kōrin's ancestors, as a direct ancestor, his great-grandfather, inscribed with his calligraphy one of these sheets, these shikishi that you see here on the left, so that Sotatsu painted. So there was a direct connection between these people and Kōrin's family, and it's very likely, and actually we do know that Kōrin owned himself works by Sotatsu because he sold off one of Sotatsu's screens for quite a bit of money when he was in financial troubles early on. So yes, there was a family connection, but Kōrin was also, and I do want to emphasize that art making is not always, as you all know, just a lofty creative process, but it's also a business in and of itself. So when Kōrin sold off this screen by Sotatsu for quite a bit of money, he most likely realized that, oh yes, Sotatsu style is so popular, I can use this for myself in order to sell more paintings. So this is there is a creative connection, there's a family connection, but there is also a down-to-earth business connection to his embrace of Sotatsu at this time. But Kōrin went further beyond that as well. So shortly after he made his irises screens, he also started working in media in which he actually was not trained. He had training in painting, but he had no training in lacquer, which is a completely different medium to work in. And I will say a few things about that in a moment. But just to say here that that Kōrin engaged in lacquer making early on, consciously diversifying his artistic portfolio from painting to various other media. And lacquer was one of those, but he also painted on textiles. So he was involved in creating bespoke textiles, kimonos, which he adorned with his paintings. So he was clearly trying to branch out as much as possible to cover a broad market in early modern art. And in order to do this, he was able to use an infrastructure of art dealerships that were scattered all over Japan, especially in major cities like Osaka, Kyoto, and Edo at the time. So, for example, in order to sell many of his works, not just to clients in Kyoto in his own environment, but also to faraway clients in Kyushu, Nagasaki, for example, in Edo. Very early on in Kōrin's career, he worked with art dealers, so-called karamonoya, that had different branch offices all over the country and could facilitate, be the mediator between a faraway client whom Kōrin never met and Kōrin in Kyoto. And they would also arrange for shipping these works by sea or by land. So there was an elaborate artistic infrastructure that Kōrin, as a budding artist, could avail himself of and dispatch his works to faraway clients as well. And this is why most of Kōrin's works are scattered all over the country. Even already we don't know many of his original clients except for letters, but we do know that his works entered the collections of powerful people all across Japan, literally all across, from the far north to Edo, to Kyoto, to down south in Kyushu. So this is one of the reasons for that, is this very elaborate system of logistical system of being able to have these intermediaries, these art dealers who could help facilitate long distance commissions. And lacquer in particular was one of those areas in which where Kōrin sent works all across the realm at the time. And but in his aesthetic for lacquer, he turned to another sort of safe bet and another innovator of the early 17th century that he had a direct connection to in the same way as he had to Sotatsu. And that person is named Honnami Koetsu, an early 17th century man of culture, a gentleman potter, a lacquer designer, a calligrapher. And Honnami Koetsu is actually the Kōrin's great-grand uncle, who was collaborating with Sotatsu. So there is this direct connection there. And Koetsu in his lacquer works introduced a completely new approach to lacquer making with these bold forms, these big areas of lead, like this bridge, for example, he has done in lead, a material that had not been used in lacquer making before him, and created very heavy objects. Usually any metal area like this would have been done in silver, but because silver is such an expensive material, it would have been impossible to create a large area like this bridge here that you see on the right box. Lead enabled a much more broader and much more bolder way of using these metal forms. And this is just one innovation that Koetsu introduced. But all of these boxes that Koetsu and Kōrin made were actually meant to hold the implements for writing. So these so-called Suzuribaku writing boxes that hold ink and brushes. But because of the use of these big areas of lead, the practicality of these boxes was actually completely defeated, because they became these heavy objects, almost obviously intended not for travel or for practical use, but for display. So, which is a really interesting shift from the practicality of this medium originally to a much more display-based and for lack of a better word, decorative usage of these objects. But let's just think a little bit more about Kōrin's own use of the lacquer medium, because in order to create a box like this, which has a wooden core, so the basic shape is carved wood, you would have to apply layer upon layer of this black lacquer, so lacquer sap mixed with black powdery pigment, layer upon layer onto the wooden surface and polish it in order to create a very lush sheen. And then on top of that, you would with a specialized brush apply these this gilded lacquer, iris stems here, and then on top of that, you apply these the flowers and mother of pearl, which had to be cut very carefully in order for them not to break. And the same as a similar sort of application would have been done for these for the lead bridge that traverses the entire composition. So this process was very difficult, and you had to be especially trained in order to be able to do it, because also lacquer sap is actually inherently toxic when wet. So it solicits an allergic reaction on the human skin. And so in order to do this, you had to have a certain amount of resilience, because you had to work with lacquer for a long time in order to have your body get used to it in the first place, but also you have to have a very specialized skill, which in short Kōrin did not possess. He was never trained in lacquer, so it's impossible. It would have been impossible for him to make a lacquer piece like this. And this is where a very interesting aspect of early modern art comes in. Kōrin, in the same way as he used these art dealers to dispatch many of his works and to work with clients, he used specialized lacquer artisans to create these works after his own specification, sort of the Jeff Koons of early modern art. He did not touch these works at all. He created the designs, he created the ideas for the works, and then sent instructions and these designs to specialized lacquer artists who would create the work for him. And Kōrin would eventually then add his name to many of these, actually. So the lacquer artists, we don't know who these people were. But eventually, these works were associated with Kōrin and Kōrin alone, which I think is a really unexpected aspect of early modern art, in a way that we always expect these to be, done by the artists we associate them with today. But actually, the process of creating these lacquer boxes was completely different, and in so many ways very modern. In that sense, for lack of a better way to put it. And here on the right, I showed you one of the designs that Kōrin made for a different piece that doesn't survive. But you can see here, this is, if you fold this, if you fold these four walls, you create a box, a dummy of a shape that is very similar to this box here on the left. So this is essentially a dummy for a not just for the design, but also for the shape and size of the box that the lacquer artist would then create in Kōrin's name. And you can see here that the design has been painted over several times, and this is part of the lacquer making process. So this work was actually created. We know that from these traces that were painted on top. It doesn't survive. We don't know where it is, but the lacquer artist who would receive this design from Kōrin would then retrace it in red lacquer, and a very thin red lacquer pigment, and then take it and paste it onto paste this design onto the lacquer and onto the box to get a ghost image of it. And in order to have the outlines, and then fill in the gaps with gilded lacquer, or whichever color Kōrin said these artisans were supposed to use. So this was a very efficient way of transferring the design that Kōrin created onto a work, onto an actual work of art, using techniques that Kōrin himself did not possess. Skills that he did not possess. And actually the way these clients were able to choose designs was also very much streamlined in so many ways, where Kōrin had a big portfolio of circular sketches like these, of all kinds of different themes. And my theory is that that these were in part used for clients to choose a specific design. Okay, well, I want irises, I want waves, and Kōrin would then combine them into more elaborate, custom-made designs for each artist. And this kind of practice is very similar to how textile patterns and how textiles were made at the time in Japan, where textile catalogs, or for lack of a better word, fashion periodicals were produced like these, where there were these templates of a kimono on each page, and a client could then point to that template, and the textile maker would then create the kimono, or whichever garment on the basis of that design. And these designs were never fully translated one-to-one to the textile, to the finished kimono, in the same way as in Kōrin's case. the designs would probably be altered, and because in these circular models, you only had a really small detail of the final design for you to see. But it seems that Kōrin was very much conscious of the lack of his own personal involvement in the making of these arts, that of these lacquer works. So in the way that this consciousness shines through in a way that many of these works emphatically include elements that seem hand-painted, such as the leaves of these iris flowers that, you know, overlap here on the bridge, or, you know, overlap on the mother of pearl flowers here. These are almost as if to immortalize the hand of an artist, just ever so slightly going across. You can, even if you see this today after 300 years, it seems as if an artist had just, you know, yesterday moved across the surface in an easy motion. And although lacquer is never applied with just one stroke of the brush, it is much more cumbersome and needs several layers in order to create an effect like this with very specialized tools. Kōrin clearly tried to sort of create the appearance of this carefree, you know, painterly quality in lacquer, and that is really a revolution in the lacquer medium in and of itself. Because before Kōrin, lacquer designs were much stiffer and much more stylized than this. So Kōrin really tried to insert the semblance of artistic immediacy into the medium. And he didn't just do this with lacquer, he did this also with ceramics. And I do want to end with thinking a little bit about ceramics today, because that is also a medium that Kōrin excelled in during the later part of his life. And I want to stay with the iris flower because he really translated that flower into virtually every medium that you could that was at the disposal of early modern artists. Kōrin worked in every medium there was for artists, except for prints. That's the only thing he didn't work in. And so towards the late part of his life, he started collaborating with his brother, the famous potter Ogata Kōrin, to create these hand-painted plates that mimic the experience of ink paintings, which is another medium that Kōrin unexpectedly worked with. And if you think about, you know, the iris's screens and these thick mineral pigments, you don't expect Kōrin to be a very proficient ink painter, but he definitely was, and he trained himself in that medium, in that very essential medium of East Asian artistic expressions. And but in this case, Kenzan, in the collaboration worked in a way that Kenzan potted these plates, and it's not, and all of you probably know this already, but just to say that creating these angular 90-degree rims here of these plates is not easy. It's very difficult because the clay will sink and it will fire and warp. So creating really, you know, sharp forms like this is very difficult. So that shows you in this very simple fashion that Kenzan was a very proficient potter, and the studio, of course, you know, produced many works like these. But they provided the surface for Kōrin, who was by then a very well-known artist, both in Edo and Kyoto, to create his hand-drawn images onto the surface of these ceramics. And in order to do this, Kōrin looked back to a long tradition of Japanese ink painting, to painters like Sesshu and his, you know, his virtuoso expressions. And we know this because Kōrin really studied Sesshu extensively and made sketches of his works, like this one here in Nara, and then translated that experience onto the ceramic medium, which is another innovation that Kōrin added to the history of Japanese art. Before him, there had never been this kind of emphatically hand-painted, emphatically ink painting-esque application of materials and expressions onto the ceramic medium. So Kōrin really pushed the boundaries between these different media by creating ceramics that really very consciously, not just in technique and appearance, but also in the way that the pigment mimics the appearance of ink, all of these things. He really tried to push to transcend the boundaries between painting and all these other media. And this is just an example for you to see how close many of these works and the brushwork is, and remember how very different the media and the materials are. Though, I mean, this bridge here on the right that was painted in ink onto gold has a completely different material quality than this iron oxide pigment that Kōrin applied onto the ceramic piece by Kenzan on the left. But still the aesthetic of it overlaps significantly, and Kōrin is trying to recreate the same kind of visuality in all of these different media, which is very hard and very cumbersome process of trial and error to accomplish this. And I want to end today's presentation just by closing the arch and looking at his final painting of irises again, one of my favorite pieces at the Met in New York, where Kōrin revisited the iris flower of his very earliest screen painting that is now at the Nezu to a composition that is similar, but in so many ways also different, because here Kōrin added the zigzagging bridge of irises with emphatically wet ink here on the surface to mimic the appearance of a bridge, of misty wet bridge in the early morning, transversing the composition. And it's so impossible on a screen to convey the mastery of this composition in and of itself, because you have to imagine the screen being standing and slightly folded here. The inward and outward folds of the screen really create a very strong sense of plasticity that completely transcend and take away the stiffness of the way the work looks here on the screen. It is displayed and standing up. It in no way looks as flat and as stylized as it does here on the screen. And these works are just separated by about a decade, but in Kōrin's terms, this is a long stretch of time, because Kōrin worked as a painter virtually only for about 2 decades of his life, because he started so late and he passed away in his late 50s. But he closed the arch. He was never he never really left his earliest works and the aesthetic that he introduced with them, say in the irises screens here at the Nezu, made very early on. And then much later, about 10 years later, he revisited these patterns that he had introduced into the irises screens and translated them into another work made for a completely different client, made for a completely different locale. The early screens were made for a Kyoto client. These ones up here were made for an Edo client. But he used the same kind of patterns, probably as a play for himself, because who else would notice this? These clients never talk to each other, of course, or at least we don't know about it. But this is just a way for you to, at the end of my talk, to really see how Kōrin stayed consistent as an artist, stayed true to a specific subject, to specific forms of expression, translated them into all kinds of different media, starting with painting through lacquer and then to ceramics, but also transcended sort of time and space in so many ways, in a way that he revisited some of the early artistic conventions that he introduced to Japanese art in so many of his different works across time and space here. And yes, this is just, and we had for the book. Then this is just the last slide before we. Before I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions, if you have any. In the design of the book, we also try to pay homage to Kōrin in so many ways and to his artistic approach to things by creating as much as possible a gorgeous design, making this book also not just a study of Kōrin, but also an object in and of itself. Thank you very much for listening, and I very much look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Frank, for this very fascinating talk. And again, congratulations on the book. It does look beautiful. Really lovely. I'm going to ask members of our audience to kindly submit questions on the chat, and I'm going to start while we wait for a few. I really enjoyed your talk, especially about this notion of repetition and how he seems to be reworking the same kinds of motifs in different media. And I really especially love the connection to textiles. And I really like how you sort of talk about how the artist's hand is always in the work of art through these painterly flat application of these brushstrokes. Again, it's really fascinating. My question really would be about sort of brand Kōrin. You did mention, of course, that he is sort of being very modern in the Jeff Koons of sorts, but it also seems to me that in picking different kind of media and using the same kinds of motifs or having pattern books of the same kinds of motifs, he's really in a position to sort of have brand Kōrin. And I'm wondering what you think about that, because I'm thinking that's really kind of guiding him in some ways to be repetitive. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that is such a good question, because it's something that I've really thought about a lot as well about when I was researching Kōrin and writing this book, and because he really was very conscious of creating a recognizable brand in a way that he used the iris flower is just one example of many different of a range of different motifs that Kōrin used all throughout his life. Plum blossoms, for example, is another. And the way that Kōrin rendered these plum blossoms is still the quintessential way of doing that in modern Japanese painting. So he created a brand to an extent that was so recognizable that it seeped into the mainstream of Japanese painting almost immediately. And that was a necessity, I think, but also a very calculated move at the same time, because the early modern Japan, especially early modern Kyoto and Kōrin's time, late 17th, early 18th century, was a place with such a strong competition. There was a plethora of different ateliers that worked in all conceivable styles. So a budding painter like Kōrin, who was not affiliated with any of the major ateliers, who had no artistic background, traditionally doesn't come from a family of painters or house of painters, he really needed to make a mark for himself in order to survive in the art world of his time. He needed to be good, yes, but he also needed to be recognizable. And in that sense, I mean, creating a brand in the way that he and other painters did was essential for survival and for establishing yourself. But Kōrin was also very much skilled at doing so, in a sense that already in his life, textile publications of the kind that I showed you earlier were taking his motifs and publishing that as Kōrin plums, Kōrin chrysanthemums, things like that. I don't know whether Kōrin encouraged this process or was even involved in it, but he certainly benefited from that big public exposure, because these fashion periodicals were read very widely.
Thank you very much for that. I do apologize. There's a beeping sound in the background. I'm sure it's going to go away. I have a question from an audience member who is very interested in Japanese women artists. And the question is addressing about how there are examples of women artists from the Kano school, the Bujunga style, the ukiyo-e, and the Moroyama Shijo school. But he's never come across any female practitioners of limpa. Do you have any, is there any examples that you're aware of, and can you elaborate?
This is a wonderful question, which I actually don't have a positive answer, but that I have come across the females in particular, unfortunately, not modern and world at least. A Korean style was, permeated into the art world of early modern Japan very recognizably, and was adopted by so many different painters of varying levels of skills. But unfortunately, all of them, at least as far as I'm aware, are male. But I do want to add that in contemporary Japanese style painting, there are many female painters who do embrace Korean style, and also sort of very much see artistic ancestry in Korean, and that's both in their personal artistic identity, but also in their styles that they use in painting. So in contemporary Japan for sure, but earlier than that, unfortunately, I'm not aware.
Well, thank you very much. I'm also wondering, it seems kind of like a funny situation or an ironic situation that he's using all these expensive materials to create these objects when he himself was in great financial difficulties. I might like to know about how did he get access to these materials if he was sort of such a struggling artist? Can you talk about how these, how these, expensive things were acquired? And also you mentioned something about the blue, but I didn't catch exactly what the blue pigment is. Could you also explain a little bit about that? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. The way artistic commissions and painting went in Japan during Korean's time was such that you would get an advance payment for the work. In an ideal case, payments were always kind of dicey to get, and there is tons of correspondence by Koreans sort of going after, you need to pay me now, and but just to say that when you ordered a painting, you would give an advance payment to the painter in order to procure the various pigments or the hardware for making the painting. For example, the folding screens Kōrin would not make himself. He would go to a specialized screen maker, and they would create the frame and the paper ground, and then send it to Kōrin. He would paint on top of it, and then somebody else would apply the gold leaf. So it was sort of a very diversified process of production. But the pigments were bought by Kōrin on the basis of the advance payment and things like that. That is not unusual and was actually common practice in early modern Japan. And to your question about the blue pigment, that is azurite. Azurite pigment, and in Kōrin's time, just about the early 18th century, miners discovered sources of azurite in Japan. Actually, before that, most of the azurite needed to be imported from places as far away as Central Asia, and so it was a very costly and very rarefied pigment that nevertheless was a staple in Japanese painting.
Great, thank you very much. We also have a question about how did the early modern period start in Japan? Okay, so I think we're talking about just sort of the development of, well, all right, I'll let you answer that. Can you explain the relationship between the modern period in Japan and elsewhere in the world? Thank you.
Yeah, so the periodization in Japan is always a question of debate for historians, art historians, and etc. So there is actually in pre-modern Japan a concept of the medieval. So I mean, there is a period that connects the early modern with the classical period, which is the Heian period, where the Tale of Genji and all these the various pieces of classical literature and poetry were conceived. So early modern is a concept, kinsei, which actually was a term that was devised already during that time. Of course, it didn't mean literally early modern; it just meant the time is now, like it's our time now. In Japan, early modern starts just about like in the last decades or so of the 16th century, and goes into the 1850s, give or take, when Japan started to have much more exposure with the outside world, where, as you all know, Japan was forced to open its ports to outside trade and refueling of Western steamships. This is where the country was opened up, and this is where the modern period sort of is being located and started. Of course, these kinds of divisions of periodizations are always problematic, but we tend to use this kind of compartmentalization of Japanese history. The relationship between early modern and modern is incredibly faceted, but just to say that in the Edo period in Japan in Kōrin's time, so many different foundations were laid for the development of pillars of modern Japanese culture, be it the publishing industry, which is still so important in Japan, or be it the aesthetics that Kōrin and other painters introduced that are still hallmarks of traditional Japanese painting today. So this is just in the art historical sense, but in the societal political sense, there are also so many different cross connections where the early seeds for it were laid during Kōrin's own period, and then elaborated upon further in the modern period. So there is a strong connection there. Yeah.
Well, again, thank you very much, Frank. We're running out of time. I'm looking very much forward to actually finally seeing your book. I'm very keen to look at it. It looks, Kōrin is such a great and fascinating painter. I imagine I hate to say this, but I know how things are. Once you finish one book, you're sort of already working on a new project. I can only hope that it's also more material from the Freer and Sackler. And if you can give us 1 or 2 sentences before you go about what you might be working on now, if I may.
Yes, sure. That's a good question. I've been thinking long and hard about what the next project is. I'm always attracted to individual painters because I do feel it gives me a wonderful opportunity to really delve into their work. And in my work on Kōrin, I accessed so much about his artistic process, about his personality through letters, through this vast correspondence that survives by him, much of which I translated, and that is in the book as well, which gives you this intimate picture into a person's psyche. So, for the next project, I want to stick to that interest, but move a bit broader. So I'm working on a project focused on dreams and sort of the visualization of dreams and the subconscious in Japanese art from early on, from the 13th century into the modern age, basically, through 5 or 6 different case studies of specific historical figures or examples that of the visualization of dreams in Japanese art.
Well, that sounds fantastic. I'll be looking forward to that one as well. I'd like to just now say, I'm sorry we've run out of time, but thank you so very much for your delivery of your research. I'm sure we're all looking forward very much to seeing your new book, and congratulations, of course, on that. Now, if I may, I'm going to close this meeting. I'd like to remind all of our audience members that our upcoming event will be happening fairly soon on Tuesday, November 9. It's going to be with Dr. Daisy Wong about the Rediscovering Palace Treasures, the Hong Kong Palace Museum. So I hope that you will be able to join us there at the Hong Kong Club. And also kindly note that in the very near future, we're going to be having Christie's Autumn Auction highlights. So everybody, thank you so very much. Thank you, Frank, so much. And I hope to see you at our next events as well.
Thank you so much.